travel with us to Toronto for a tour of one of the finest collections of Islamic art, the Aga Khan Museum, with Dr. Marika Sardar, art historian and curator. Marika picks out her 10 favorites in this LHI Circle special.
Hi, I'm Marika Sardar. I am curator at the Aga Khan Museum, and I've joined here about 2.5 years ago, having bounced around from several museums at this point now. So I started off at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, working in the Department of Islamic Art there. Traveled over to the San Diego Museum of Art, where they have the excellent Edwin Binney collection of Indian paintings. Then I spent a couple of years at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha as their curator for South Asia before arriving in Toronto. The Aga Khan Museum is located in Toronto, Ontario. It opened in 2014, and the patron behind our museum is His Highness Prince Karim Aga Khan, who is the leader of the Ismaili community. And our collection is primarily one put together by the uncle of Prince Karim. So this is Prince Sadruddin, who died in 2003, and it's decided his collection would form the basis of a museum. So we have about 1,000 works of art, all in the field of Islamic art specifically. So that is the context that we exhibit our Indian collection within. Our collection, so on the one hand, it follows sort of the classical outlines of Islamic art, how it's been defined in Europe and the US. So, really focusing on the Mughals, for instance, but a foray into the Deccan and things like that. But there are some really important early landmarks of Sultanate painting, which is so rare. Very little has survived from sort of before the 1500s in South Asia. So we have a few manuscripts from that era. And then you can see, where Prince Sadruddin's personal interests took him. And we do have examples of works of art from other courts that did not have Muslim rulers, but obviously you can't divide up South Asia in that way. So, absolutely you need a record of everything being produced in 16th, 17th, 18th century to really understand. If you just extract those works of art made at Muslim courts, you're getting a very skewed picture of the subcontinent. Our museum is located on the sort of northeastern outskirts of Toronto. We're a bit remote from city center, but I think this shows a lot of foresight. There is a new subway line being built, and the city is so rapidly growing. I'm sure we'll be in the middle of things within a few years. And we share our site with the Ismaili Center and a park that's open to the public. And this all opened in fall 2014. And as I mentioned, the Aga Khan supports an award for architecture. So naturally, the people chosen to design this whole campus are names you will have heard of. So the Ismaili Jamaat Khana there has been designed by Charles Correa, the gardens by Vladimir Jurovich, and our own building by Fumihiko Maki, who has worked with His Highness on various projects, including Aga Khan University building in London. And we're this sort of futuristic white stone object that's sort of landed in the middle of this garden. And so inside there's lots of light, there's patterns drawn from sort of the kind of window claddings you might expect to see in Middle Eastern architecture. And it forms this very contemporary, welcoming space for our collection hall. in which we are able to display about 250 objects at a time. And because our collections tend to be things like manuscripts and paintings, we are constantly changing over those items that are light sensitive. So the galleries themselves are organized chronologically and geographically. So starting off with some features that might be shared across the world of Islamic art, and then looking at different regions as the religion and the culture spread. So starting with sort of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, that area, and culminating in South Asia. So we have maybe 30 items dealing with South Asia at any given time. And the idea is to just give kind of a peek into what's happening. As I mentioned, we've got some real highlights, especially from the Mughal court, but it's so important for me, at least, to provide some kind of context for the world that those Mughal works of art are being produced in. So things from other courts are brought in with each rotation of 6 months to give sort of a flavor of other traditions from the subcontinent. Today, I'll be taking you through 10 of the treasures of our Indian paintings collection. So the first item I wanted to show you is something known as the Gwalior Quran. It is a nearly completely intact Quran that not only provides great documentary evidence in the fact that it survived to us in this condition, but also it has a colophon at the end that gives the name of the person who copied it. It gives the date that it was completed, which converts to 1399. And it says that he finished it while sitting in the fortress of Gwalior. So it's an incredibly informative inscription. And I think we might have been hesitant to give it such a date or attribute it to Gwalior without having this inscription, because we don't think of that place as a center for Islamic art necessarily at that particular moment. But I think that just opens our eyes as scholars and as audiences to sort of many centers beyond, say, Delhi, where we might think of as most activity taking place in the Sultanate period, or Mandu, where we have some other manuscripts, but really is wonderful evidence for populations moving around, Muslims being in different areas, and then also having the resources to create such a manuscript. It's got so many pages of illumination. You open at different sections, so it's divided into 7 parts, and to mark those 7 parts, you have double pages of illumination. And then when you're looking at the text, it's got a script in gold, in blue and red. It's got Persian translations underneath. It's got illuminations in the margins that also act as different markers of divisions of the text. It's just such a rich document. And I think one of the most intriguing things about it comes at the end. There is what is known as a falname. So it is a guide to sort of determining a course of action based on what the Quran tells you. So this is something you also find in Iranian Quran manuscripts of about the same period. It's not common now, but this absolutely was part of a larger trend. And so it gives instructions for opening the Quran at random to a certain page. You read down a prescribed number of lines and look to a certain letter within that row. And then depending on what letter that is, the book provides some guidance on what you should or shouldn't do. So at the end of the manuscript, you'll see examples under each letter, then some text providing you with guidance. So I think it's just really changes how we understand Qurans being used with today's lens. Another landmark of Sultanate painting from the collection is a page from this manuscript that is actually quite well known, considering that its pieces are in, maybe 25, 30 different collections at the moment. But that does mean we have a good sense of the object as a whole once you put it back together. And the text is the Khamseh of Amir Khusro Pahlavi. So it's an Indian poet writing in response to the great Persian poet Nizami, who has this Khamseh, sort of 5 parts, a quintet of poems, and that was written several centuries before Amir Khusro was living in Delhi, but it's a text we know today and that people still read, memorize, and so on. So he writes sort of a response, a version of Nizami's classic. And this page comes from the first section, and it's actually kind of a sad story in a way. We have this very religious Muslim figure who has been meditating, reflecting on the message of the Quran and Muhammad for years, and is specifically waiting for the turning of the night during Ramadan that marks when Muhammad received the first revelations. But just as the moon is coming up, so that bow shape you see at the top of the painting, he has fallen asleep and has missed the key moment. So I am not quite sure, to be honest, what the moral of that story is, but I think we are to admire his devotion and the amount of time that he has spent reflecting on the message of the Quran. But this manuscript also is key for our understanding of this period, that, as I mentioned, we have so few landmarks to go on, as so many manuscripts have been lost in the intervening centuries. So this shows us maybe not the highest level of court production, but it's interesting that it's been attributed to so many different places, from Iran to Syria to Iraq over the years. So it's showing this broader connection of India within, this interconnected world of Islamic art, where you're reading literature in Persian, where artists are producing manuscripts that could be mistaken for things from, other parts of the Middle East. And the paintings themselves very much relate in the style. So they're obviously looking at manuscripts from these other parts of the world for their inspiration, but it's little clues about the paper and the pigments that they're using that have helped scholars like Eloise Park de la Perrière, who has studied this, to now bring it back within the fold of Indian development of Persian language manuscript painting. The collection then shows the coming together of various traditions then between the Indic and the importation of these, Persian styles of illuminating and illustrating, sort of culminating in, of course, the Mughal period, which everyone upholds as sort of the pinnacle of sort of a new creation based on all of these streams coming together within the subcontinent. But the paintings that I've chosen from our collection from the Mughal period, I think just have some lovely details to them. If we're familiar with what's happening during this period, there is still much to discover and love in individual examples. So we have a page from a Harivamsa manuscript. So this is a text that's translated from the Sanskrit during Emperor Akbar's period. And we have at least one copy of the text that is illustrated. So again, this is a manuscript known only from its dispersed pages rather than an intact holding today, but we place it in about 1590 for production. And this story behind this particular painting is that Shiva has given a boon to this one of his devotees to be able to kill anybody he desires just by putting his hand above him. So naturally, this leads to all kinds of trouble. And Vishnu is called to the rescue, and he tricks the demon into placing his hand over his own head, and poof, the demon burns up and problem solved. So not only do we have the depiction of the Hindu gods, obviously you see the iconographic connections to traditional sculpture, but seeing them in vivid color, I think it is sort of a treat of these Mughal paintings that show Hindu subject matter. But the demon himself is quite lovely in his own way, with his fantastic horns, and he's covered by bumps and scales and this hideous skin. And then in the background also, as you're looking at the landscape behind him in that fantastic rocky formation, you can also see some faces hidden there, some grotesques as they're called. So I think the artists of this page were really having fun with sort of the more outlandish aspects of the painting, things you don't get to include when you have to make a royal portrait and, treat your subjects with absolute reverence. The next painting is another highlight of our Mughal period collection, and is, maybe more typical of, the height of court painting here. It shows a portrait of Jahangir, but it's also acts as sort of a pictorial family tree. So you have him in the center, in the central hub, surrounded by all these spokes, which are 4 of his sons, their sons in the top of this chart, and then below that, one of their Timurid ancestors. And so this shows in a very visual way where Jahangir sees himself, right? So this, as rulers, they always connect themselves to this sort of legendary conqueror Timur, who lived, 1370s he died in 1405. So this is, several hundred years before Jahangir himself. But Timur is such a revered and feared figure in the Islamic world. It would still have resonance in 17th century, in Jahangir's time. The Mughals consider themselves Timurids in that line. They don't call themselves Mughals, actually. And so they reinforce this in many different ways through paintings where you have imaginary scenes of Timur handing a crown to one of the Mughal emperors and so on. So this chart shows that connection between them in terms of exact descent. So at the bottom of it, you have a portrait of Miran Shah, who is the son of Timur, from whom the Mughals themselves descend. Now, there's been some speculation about this painting, and one of the reasons I brought it up here is, how this is constructed, because you will notice that Jahangir's most famous son, Khurram, who rules as Shah Jahan, is missing from the composition. So there's speculation that Khurram should have appeared in the place of Miran Shah, but that in fact his image had been covered over by a portrait of this Timurid figure sometime around the year 1623, when he had rebelled against Jahangir and then had been removed from the line of succession officially. But as I was looking over the painting again in preparation for this session, I noticed that Jahangir is painted facing towards his son Parvez, and that he has this falcon, and Parvez is in fact then shown facing Jahangir with his hands outstretched. And this is a very typical formula of accession types of portraits, or portraits made to signal a line of succession to the throne. So when that falcon is being presented to the favored son. So that year of 1623 still makes sense. So when Shah Jahan has rebelled, proved himself disloyal, and for a brief moment of time, Parvez is meant to succeed Jahangir. And I think that this painting never included Shah Jahan, in fact, because it wouldn't have made sense for him to be below and originally intended to be shown as the successor when Jahangir is not facing him at all and is very much oriented towards this other son. So while we've been looking at all these lovely paintings, I think it's also important to recognize how much calligraphy was also prized at the court. So it's not just the painters who are being employed, but also, different calligraphers were equally well known, equally rewarded, and on the sort of court registers as well. And so this example, we don't know exactly where it is from within the subcontinent, but you can easily imagine perhaps a Deccan court. And this is a calligraphic arrangement of a prayer to Imam Ali, but that takes the form of a lion, and Ali himself is compared to a lion. So you can see why the calligrapher has perhaps chosen this form for the writing. And we see this type of decorative arrangement of calligraphy in other Deccan examples, not only in things written in ink on the page, but we have examples of metalwork, for instance, pierced metal standards, a falcon in the form of calligraphy as well. There's a famous example from the V&A. So this one is reading from right to left across the line, and so on his flank you can see the word Ali repeating 3 times. That's sort of the end of the prayers, these exhortations to him repeatedly, but it forms this beautiful sort of visual gesture across the page as well. And I think this is a theme of the examples we're looking at. There's also something of a little bit of a mystery. So we have a signature or the name of a calligrapher at the end, but it's actually understood that the person who made this example in the 17th century is copying the composition from an earlier calligrapher down to including his signature as well. But this person sitting in the 17th century hasn't included his own name. And then surrounding this line, we have this beautiful gold field of flowers. And then there is another border around that. And as we've been talking about things moving out of their original context, it does seem that the plain paper that now surrounds this lion might be, sort of a second or third home for this in its original context in an album. It must have had decorated borders at that time. We wouldn't imagine this blank folio surrounding such a composition. Another masterpiece by Abul Hassan in our collection, made around the same time, has now a totally different subject matter. This is based on a European print, apparently, showing Madonna, Child, and Saint Anne. And, this early drawing that I mentioned that we have by Abul Hassan, at age 13, shows Saint John the Evangelist. So this kind of Christian subject matter based on Prince being brought to the Mughal court is something he's been experimenting with, his entire career. At this point, is obviously something both in terms of style, in terms of subject matter, that interests him, and we can see him working through this. So what might at first also look like a straightforward copy of a print, you realize on further investigation, and this is something that scholars like Mika Natif have been looking into, sort of how these images are being manipulated and played with by the artist. So you have this insertion of different background elements that are very much from the world of Mughal painting. You have this very light wash of color that's introduced, so that this is, the print we imagine was black and white, but there is this genre of drawing in both the Persianate and Indian sphere called Neem Kalam, where you have the black lines of ink and then these very subtle colors introduced, but not in that opaque layer upon layer typical style of Indian painting. So, in this set of Mughal paintings, we have a rich set of intellectual interests, from Sanskrit texts to allusions to Persian poetry, to now this whole world of European art that manifests itself in a large set of Mughal paintings showing religious figures. And we can conclude our tour through our Mughal highlights with this exquisite small painting by Abul Hasan. So a star, we're still in sort of the Jahangir period, early 1600s, but this is an artist who has grown up in the court. His father was an artist himself. We have examples of work from when he was a teenager. It's really extraordinary the way we can map Abul Hasan's career. But really feel a connection to this particular painting when you again take a look at the details of this figure. We see that he's devoted his entire life to prayer and to thoughts of God. His clothes, the way he holds himself, his body. We can see the toll of these years of living as a mendicant. But then when we zoom back out on the painting, so you just have this very dark, moody background. And when you're looking at it from a distance, you just see this stooped figure and then the flower in the corner that's bending towards him as though he's the source of light and illumination. And the way that these two elements just sit on the page, I think, is just so evocative. And we have this tiny signature of Abul Hasan, and it uses the name that he was given by Jahangir, Nadir al-Zaman, the sort of wonder of the age. But we know immediately who this is referring to because Jahangir also records the bestowing of this title upon Abul Hasan in his memoirs. And the page that this is set in is lovely in itself, but doesn't seem to be contemporary to the painting. So it looks like as this painting moved from some sort of imperial album, someone else has reframed it in borders perhaps intended for another type of book. But, it still coordinates visually. There is a sensitivity in how this painting has been placed. For something completely different, we can move now to sort of 1760s Faizabad. So we're still in northern India, but sort of moved out of the Mughal court. And I think people often look to areas like this, to Awadh and so on, where Mughal artists are traveling, Mughal-trained artists are moving, but as the imperial workshop itself shrinks and, like aspects of patronage change there. But what I think we see here in this really dynamic, kind of fun painting is the development of something new. We don't want to see it as a sort of descendant as Mughal period. So this is actually a kind of painting. We see several examples coming out of the same court and period with these interesting panoramic views where you see courtyard after courtyard of a palace receding into this landscape in the background, and each layer of the painting has so many details. So up front, we're looking at this group of women gathering, and one is entertaining the other. She's balancing this glass bottle full of liquid, perhaps some wine. You can see music being performed and so on. But then if you stretch right back into the painting, you cross a river, you go into a walled garden, and the details, even in the background, are exquisite, of people either just on the boats going about daily life. There's a little procession. You see people in the garden in the background. So there's just so much to grab onto this in this painting, and it's all organized in this very dynamic perspective. So you give a sense as though everything's converging into a single point, but when you step back a second, you realize how much has actually been manipulated to give you these views into this succession of planes moving backwards. So immediately you'll notice this perspective is different from, the paintings of about a century earlier that we were looking at in the Mughal sphere, where you have, things in the background are simply higher on the page. And so you don't have that overlapping to give you a sense of spatial recession, in perhaps the European tradition or so on. But now we see in these group of paintings coming out of Faizabad a development of a different way of handling perspective, where it's somewhere in between that stacking of spaces vertically, and also having some objects block the view of others so that they give the appearance of coming in close. So this is something sort of particular to this 18th century sphere that we're in. So you might find it in other courts, but it's not something that we're seeing earlier on. And the artist of this painting, again, we have another tiny signature, is known for this kind of work. So we have many other examples by Faizullah of these panoramas of palaces and gardens and so on, and many with lovely ladies as well. So our collection goes up to the 19th century. So we, really see so many different aspects of this history across the subcontinent. And by this point, not only have styles changed, but sort of the political landscape has changed. So this portrait shows a known figure, Sir Henry Fane, a Britisher who was commander-in-chief of the Indian Army posted in the Punjab between 1835 and 40. But the way he's framed is, as you might see a lovely Kangra maiden, he's in this oval frame with the arabesques and so on in the corners, but instead we have this Englishman seated very, very properly on a chair instead. And it was interesting to read a bit more about him and try and think about the circumstances of the painting of this particular portrait. And one of the clues I noticed was the star on his chest, the medal that he's wearing. And in fact, in 1837, he was awarded the Order of the Auspicious Star by Ranjit Singh. And so I'm imagining that maybe this painting was made at the court at the time that he was given this honor. And so this painting shows, not too long after Henry Fain was operating in the Punjab, we have this grandson of Ranjit Singh, who is the one depicted here in this lovely court performance of dance and music, attended also by the ruler's little white dog who's sitting by the throne. But what's sort of a puzzle of this painting is that it's been produced about 30 years after this man has been assassinated, and just trying to untangle who was actually in power at this time in the 1870s. So by now Punjab is a province under British rule. Why this particular moment in time would be memorialized. This is someone who only ruled for a couple of short years. He was put on the throne as a puppet. He was assassinated. He wasn't the legendary Ranjit Singh. And why this particular event, then it seems like something that maybe we imagined, but that was happening fairly regularly at court, dancing girls, musicians, all this. So I think that's just all these other layers to this painting that still would like to uncover and understand better. It's been a real pleasure to present these 10 paintings, and I'm looking forward to discussing them in greater detail in our live session.